Jinwoo adjusted his headset and leaned closer to the ship's control panel. The screen in front of him flickered with faint signals. His brow furrowed as he focused on a strange sound coming through the system. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had heard before. "What is it?" Captain Yunjin's voice was sharp. She walked over to his station, her arms crossed. She was always serious, always careful. Jinwoo knew she didn't like surprises. "It's a distress signal," Jinwoo said. He pointed to the screen. "It's coming from a small ship near that planet." Yunjin looked at the planet ahead. It was covered in swirling green clouds, and its surface looked rough and rocky. "Do we know who it's from?" she asked. Jinwoo shook his head. "No, but the signal is weak. Whoever it is, they might need help." The rest of the crew gathered around. Jian, the ship's navigator, looked uneasy. "It could be dangerous. We don't know what's out there," she said. "We're explorers," Jinwoo replied. "Isn't that why we're here? To find the unknown." The crew exchanged nervous glances. Jinwoo could feel their hesitation, but he also felt something else. A pull. The signal was faint, almost like a whisper, and it made him curious. He couldn't just ignore it. Captain Yunjin sighed. "All right," she said finally, "but we'll be careful. Jian, get us closer. Jinwoo, keep monitoring the signal. If things look bad, we leave." "Understood." "Yes, Captain," Jinwoo said, relief washing over him. The handsome moved toward the signal. The ship's engines hummed softly as they entered the strange planet's orbit. Through the main window, Jinwoo saw the small alien craft for the first time. It was damaged, its surface covered in scratches and burns. Parts of it were missing, and it looked like it had barely survived whatever had attacked it. "It's falling apart," Jian said. "How is it even sending a signal?" "We'll find out," Yunjin said. "Prepare the docking bay." The crew worked quickly, bringing the alien craft aboard. As the ship's doors closed, everyone stood back, waiting. The air was tense. Jinwoo's heart raced as he approached the craft. It was small, almost like a pod, with strange markings along its sides. He touched the surface carefully. It was cold and smooth, unlike anything he had ever felt. "Is anyone inside?" Yunjin asked. Jinwoo nodded. "There's movement. I think someone's alive in there." They opened the pod slowly, and the first thing Jinwoo saw was light. Soft, blue light glowing from inside. Then a figure emerged. It was a girl, but not like any girl Jinwoo had ever seen. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her large, shining eyes seemed to glow with their own light. Her hair floated softly around her, as if it had a life of its own. She was small, delicate, and looked terrified. The girl stepped out, wobbling slightly. She held up her hands, palms facing outward, as if trying to show she wasn't a threat. "She's an alien," Jian whispered. The girl looked around, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Then she spoke, but her words were strange, a series of sounds and tones that no one understood. "Can we translate that?" Yunjin asked. Jinwoo shook his head. "It's not in the database, but maybe we can try gestures." He stepped forward slowly, holding up his hands the same way she did. "It's okay," he said gently. "We won't hurt you." The girl tilted her head, watching him carefully. Then she pointed to herself and made a sound. "Arai." "Is that her name?" Jian asked. "I think so," Jinwoo said. He pointed to himself and said, "Jinwoo." Then he pointed to the captain. "Yunjin." The girl, Arai, repeated their names, her voice soft but clear. She looked relieved, as if she understood they were trying to help. "What do we do with her?" Jian asked. Yunjin looked at Arai, her expression thoughtful. "We find out who she is, where she's from, and how we can help her. But we stay cautious. We don't know anything about her or what she might bring." Jinwoo nodded, but he couldn't help feeling excited. This was the kind of moment he had dreamed of, a real encounter with the unknown. As he watched Array explore the room with wide-eyed wonder, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the start of something extraordinary. The handsong was quiet after they brought Array aboard. Jinwoo sat at his station, staring at the screens, his mind racing. Array was in the small crew area, sitting on a chair, looking around with wide eyes. The crew had given her water, but she hadn't spoken much after that first introduction. "Do you think she understands us?" Jaehyun asked from across the room. Jinwoo looked at Array, who was still studying everything around her, touching objects and pointing at things with interest. "I think she does. She's not scared, just curious. She probably doesn't know our language," Yoonjin said, standing by the doorway. "We need to find a way to communicate." Jinwoo nodded. He had a few ideas. He turned back to his panel and started working on the translation software. It wasn't perfect, but he had some faith that it could help. After some time, the translation device flashed to life. It was basic, but it could try to match the sounds Array made with words. Jinwoo walked over to where Array was sitting. She looked up as he approached. "Hello," Jinwoo said slowly, watching her reaction. Array blinked at him and tilted her head, clearly confused. She repeated the word back, but it sounded different, more musical. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and high-pitched. Jinwoo smiled. "That's right. Hello. My name is Jinwoo. What's your name?" Array made a sound, a short noise that didn't sound like a word in any language Jinwoo knew. She then pointed to herself again and said, "Array." Jinwoo nodded. "Array." He repeated the name slowly. "Array." She smiled a little, pleased. Then she pointed at the water bottle on the table. She made a sound that Jinwoo couldn't understand, but it sounded like a question. "Water?" Jinwoo asked, pointing to the bottle. Array nodded quickly. "Water," she said, her voice sounding pleased that Jinwoo understood. "Water," Jinwoo repeated. "Yes, it's water." As Jinwoo worked with Array, trying to help her understand their language, the crew started to talk about other things they needed to know. "We need to know more about her," Yoonjin said, sitting down at the table with Jinwoo. "Where is she from? What happened to her ship?" Jinwoo turned to Array and tried to ask her. "Where is your ship?" he said, using gestures to show that he was asking about her ship. Array looked at him for a moment, then pointed at the window. She made a sound, something that sounded like Bergen. "Bergen?" Jinwoo asked, trying to understand. "Is that the name of your ship?" Array looked at him, her eyes full of hope. "Bergen," she repeated, then made a sad sound. Jinwoo's heart softened. "Your ship, it's gone." Array nodded slowly, her face falling into a look of sadness. She made a motion with her hands, as if showing something breaking into pieces. "It was destroyed," Jinwoo said quietly. Array nodded again, her eyes filled with tears. Jinwoo felt bad, but he didn't know how to comfort her. She was so far from home. "We'll help you," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll help you find out what happened and how to fix your ship." Array looked up at him, her face lighting up a little. She whispered, "Fix." Jinwoo smiled. "Yes, we'll fix it." While Jinwoo continued talking with Array, the rest of the crew tried to learn more about the alien girl. Jaehyun worked with the scanners, trying to understand more about Array's biology. She had already noticed that Array didn't seem to eat the same way humans did. She didn't need regular meals, and the food they gave her barely seemed to satisfy her. "Maybe she doesn't need food like we do," Jaehyun said. "Maybe she only needs certain things to survive." Yoonjin nodded. "Keep checking. We need to know everything we can about her." Later that day, Jinwoo sat with Array, showing her pictures of human food on a tablet. He pointed to each one, saying the words slowly. "This is bread. This is fruit. This is rice." Array's eyes sparkled as she looked at the pictures. She touched the screen and repeated the words after him, trying to match his voice. Bread, fruit, rice. Jinwoo smiled. She was learning quickly. Suddenly, Array pointed at a picture of dried squid. She made a noise that sounded like excitement. That one, she said, touching the screen. Jinwoo raised an eyebrow. You want to try that? Array nodded eagerly. Yes, give. Jinwoo wasn't sure if she understood exactly, but he nodded and went to the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a small piece of dried squid. He handed it to her. Array looked at it for a moment, then took a small bite. Her eyes lit up as she chewed. She looked at Jinwoo, her expression full of surprise. Good, she said. Then she held the piece up again, looking at him expectantly. More, she said. Jinwoo laughed. More. Array nodded eagerly. More, she repeated, her voice almost a plea. He smiled and went back to the kitchen, bringing more of the dried squid. As he handed it to her, she smiled wide, clearly pleased. Thank you, she said, her voice soft and sincere. Jinwoo's heart warmed. Despite the language barrier, despite the differences between them, there was a bond forming between him and Array. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he felt certain that this strange, curious alien girl was about to change everything. Days passed on the Hanseong, and with each day, the crew learned more about Array. She was full of surprises. Her curiosity seemed endless, and she quickly adapted to the crew's way of life, even though she didn't fully understand everything. One morning, Jinwoo was sitting at his station when Array approached him, her eyes wide with interest. She pointed at the screen in front of him, where he was studying data on the planet they had just passed. What is this? Array asked, her voice soft but clear. Jinwoo smiled. It's information about the planet we flew past yesterday. It's a part of our job to study these things. He paused, looking at her. Do you want to learn? Array nodded enthusiastically, her eyes glowing with excitement. Learn, she repeated. Jinwoo showed her how the system worked, pointing at the pictures and charts on the screen. He explained the different colors and symbols, even though he wasn't sure how much she could understand. To his surprise, Array paid close attention, nodding and making noises of approval as he talked. You're a quick learner, Jinwoo said with a laugh. Array smiled, pleased. Quick. Later that day, the crew gathered in the dining area for lunch. As usual, the room was filled with the sound of clinking plates and quiet chatter. But Array wasn't eating. She was watching everyone closely, her eyes moving from person to person, trying to understand what they were doing. Jaeyeon noticed. What's wrong, Array? She asked, sitting beside her. Array looked at her and pointed at the food on Jaeyeon's plate. What is this? She asked, her voice full of curiosity. Jaeyeon smiled. That's kimchi, she said, pushing the bowl closer to Array. It's spicy, but it's good. Array sniffed the dish, then carefully dipped her finger into the sauce. She tasted it, and her eyes immediately widened. She blinked, trying to understand the strong, fiery taste. Spicy, she exclaimed, her face full of surprise. Hot. Jaeyeon laughed. Yes, it's very spicy, but you get used to it. Array hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a small piece with her fingers and ate it. Her face twisted for a second, but then she smiled. Good. I like. The crew chuckled. Even though Array was still learning, it was clear she was trying to fit in. She was getting better at understanding human food and culture, though there was still much she didn't understand. Over the next few days, Array's interest in food became a running joke among the crew. She would ask to try everything. She wanted to know what each dish was, how it was made, and most of all, she wanted to taste it. One afternoon, as Jinwoo prepared lunch, Array came over to his workstation, her eyes sparkling. Can you give it again in my mouth? She asked, pointing at the food. Jinwoo froze, his hand midair with a spoon. He blinked. What did you say? Array repeated the sentence, her words clear but strange. Can you give it again in my mouth? Jinwoo's face turned red, and he quickly turned away to hide his smile. He hadn't expected her to say something like that. He glanced at Jaehyun, who was trying hard not to laugh. Yunjin, who was standing by the doorway, raised an eyebrow. Is something wrong? Jinwoo cleared his throat. No, she's just asking for more food. The crew burst into laughter, but Array looked confused. I said wrong, she asked, tilting her head. Jaehyun shook her head, still chuckling. No, you didn't say anything wrong. You just said it, a little differently. Array frowned, trying to understand. Different? Jinwoo smiled, finally able to speak. It's okay. I'll explain it to you later. He handed her a spoonful of food. Here, you can have more. Array took the spoon and ate the food, smiling happily. Thank you, she said. I like. Jinwoo laughed and sat down next to her. You're very curious, aren't you? Array nodded, her eyes bright. Curious, she repeated. Later that day, the crew began to notice something else. Array didn't just ask about food. She wanted to know about human traditions, too. She would watch the crew as they worked and asked questions about everything. Why they did certain tasks, how they celebrated holidays, and even about their history. One evening, as they were having a meeting, Array raised her hand. Yunjin looked at her. Yes, Array. Why do you celebrate? Array asked. What is the reason? Jaehyun thought for a moment. We celebrate to remember important moments, she said, like birthdays, holidays, or even big achievements. It's our way of being thankful for the good things in life. Array nodded. Thankful, she repeated, her eyes thoughtful. The conversation turned into a long discussion about human celebrations, holidays, and customs. It was clear that Array was trying hard to understand human emotions and the connections people had to their traditions. She was fascinated by the idea of gratitude and celebration, even if she couldn't fully grasp it yet. That night, as Jinwoo sat in his quarters, he thought about Array and all the questions she had asked. She was so different, yet so similar. She wanted to know more about the world and the people around her, just like any curious human. He smiled to himself. Array was becoming a part of their crew. She had found a place among them, and she was slowly starting to understand what it meant to be human. The days on the Hansong passed quietly, but the crew remained cautious. Even though Array was learning quickly and growing comfortable with the humans, they still had many questions about her. They didn't know where she came from or why she was alone. One evening, as they were traveling through deep space, something unexpected happened. The ship suddenly shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. A loud alarm blared throughout the ship. Captain, we've lost power. Jaehyun's voice was full of panic. The engines aren't responding. Yunjin quickly stood up, her face serious. Everyone, to your stations. Jinwoo, get to the control panel. Jinwoo rushed to his seat, his heart racing. What's happening? He asked, tapping quickly at the controls. The screen was flashing red, showing signs of a power failure. It looks like we've been hit by something. A strong force, maybe a magnetic pulse, Jaehyun said, her eyes scanning the system. By what? Yunjin asked sharply. I don't know, Jaehyun responded. But we've lost all connection with the outer sensors. We're flying blind. The Hansong shook again, and the lights flickered. Array, who had been sitting quietly in the crew area, looked up, clearly confused and frightened. She stood up and walked toward the control room. What's happening? She asked, her voice shaky. Yunjin turned to her. Stay back, Array. It's dangerous right now. Array didn't listen. She walked forward, her face full of determination. She stepped up next to Jinwoo and pointed at the control panel. What's this? She asked, her eyes studying the flashing lights. Jinwoo looked at her in surprise. That's the ship's control system. It's broken right now. We're trying to figure out what caused it. Array raised an eyebrow and then gently touched the panel. She made a soft sound, almost like a hum, and the lights on the panel blinked for a moment before settling back to normal. Hey, what did you do? Jinwoo asked, wide-eyed. Array looked up at him, smiling slightly. Fixed. Jinwoo stared at her in disbelief. How had she fixed it so easily? The ship was in trouble, and now it was starting to stabilize. The shaking stopped, and the lights returned to normal. You fixed it, Jinwoo repeated. Array nodded, pleased with herself. Fixed, she said again, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Yeonjin watched everything carefully. How did you do that? She asked, her voice full of suspicion. Array smiled but didn't answer. She just shrugged and stepped back from the panel, as if it was nothing important. Jinwoo stood up slowly, still staring at the controls. I don't understand. That was incredible. We couldn't even get the systems to respond before. And now, they're fine. Yeonjin crossed her arms. This isn't normal. Array, how did you know how to fix it? Array looked at Yeonjin, her large eyes full of calm confidence. I know, she said simply. The crew exchanged worried glances. There was something about Array that they still didn't fully understand. How did she know about technology that was so far beyond what she could have learned from her own people? Yeonjin didn't trust it. Jinwoo, do a full system check, she ordered. I want to make sure everything is safe before we move forward. Jinwoo quickly started running the diagnostic tests on the ship. Everything seemed to be fine now, but there was still an unsettling feeling in the air. Array had fixed the problem so easily, but how was that possible? As Jinwoo worked, Array sat quietly at the back of the room, watching him. She seemed peaceful, but there was a strange energy about her, as if she was waiting for something. Jinwoo couldn't help but feel that there was more to her than met the eye. Everything looks fine, Jinwoo said finally, his voice unsure. But there's still something strange going on. The ship's systems are working, but I don't know how. Yeonjin turned to Array, her face serious. Array, what do you know about this ship's technology? You've never seen anything like this before. How did you fix it? Array stood up, her expression soft. I know how to fix things, she said simply. I know how to make things work. Jinwoo frowned. You make it sound like it's easy for you, but this is advanced technology. It doesn't just work for anyone. Array didn't respond. She only looked at him for a long moment, her eyes full of quiet certainty. Yeonjin was silent for a while, thinking. Jinwoo, Jo-yeon, keep a close eye on Array. We need to know if she can control more than just the ship's systems. We still don't know who she really is or what she can do. Jinwoo didn't like it, but he knew Yeonjin was right. They had no idea what Array was capable of. She had saved them this time. But was it really a coincidence, or did she have powers that no one understood? As the crew went back to their work, the mood shifted. They had to keep going, but the question of Array's true abilities lingered in their minds. Was she a friend, or was she something more? For now, the crew had no answers. But one thing was clear. This encounter with the unknown was far from over. The crew of the Hansong was on edge after the strange incident with Array fixing the ship. They didn't know what to make of it. How could she have done it so easily? There were still many unanswered questions, and no one felt completely comfortable. Jinwoo couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He spent hours at the control panel, trying to figure out what went wrong with the ship's systems, but everything seemed fine now. It was like nothing had ever happened. He couldn't ignore the feeling that Array had something to do with it, but he didn't know how to explain it. Meanwhile, Array went about her usual routine. She spent time learning more about the crew and their ways. She continued to ask questions, curious about everything around her. But whenever the crew tried to talk to her about the incident, she just smiled and said, I fixed it. without offering any other explanation. It was frustrating. Later that evening, as the crew gathered for dinner, Yunjin looked at Jinwoo and Jiayun. "We need to talk about Array," she said quietly. "I don't trust that she's telling us everything." Jiayun nodded. "I agree. She's too calm, too controlled. There's something off about her." Jinwoo sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know what to think anymore. I want to believe that she's just a girl who's lost and alone, but it doesn't add up." Yunjin leaned forward. "What if she's not just some lost traveler? What if she's hiding something? We need to find out who she really is." Just then, Array walked into the room, her eyes scanning the crew. She smiled as she sat down at the table. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but warm. The crew greeted her back, though there was a noticeable tension in the air. Array seemed to notice, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she picked up her bowl of food and began eating quietly, as if nothing was wrong. Yunjin watched her closely. "Array," she began, "can we talk?" Array looked up, her eyes full of curiosity. "Talk? About what?" Jiayun spoke up. "We need to understand more about you. We've been traveling together for days now, and we still don't know much about who you are." Array paused for a moment, then smiled again. "I told you. I'm Ara." Jinwoo exchanged a glance with Yunjin. "But that's not enough. We need to know more. Where did you come from? Why are you alone? And how did you fix the ship earlier? That's not something a normal person can do." Array tilted her head, as if considering his words. Then she placed her bowl down and looked at them all carefully. "I told you. I know things," she said slowly. "I know how things work, how to fix them." Yunjin's patience was wearing thin. "That's not an answer. We need to know what you really are." Array's expression softened, and she looked down at her hands. "I am just me. I am no different from you." Jiayun leaned forward. "But you are different. You're not like anyone we've ever met before. Your technology, the way you fixed the ship, it's all so much more advanced than anything we know. We need to understand how you did it." Array was quiet for a moment, then looked back up at them. "I come from a place far away, a place you don't know. My people are different, but we're not so different in the end." Jinwoo was skeptical. "What do you mean? Where are you from? Why are you here?" Array's eyes seemed to darken for a moment, as if she was remembering something painful. "I don't know where I am now. I was on my ship. But my ship, it is gone." Her voice faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered. "I am alone. I was looking for something, and now I am lost." Yunjin frowned. "Lost? You said you know how to fix things. What was it you were looking for?" Array's expression grew serious, and for the first time, she seemed almost sad. "I was looking for help," she said softly. "My people are gone. I came to find answers." There was a long silence. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that Array was hiding something, but she was also telling them that something terrible had happened to her. The mystery deepened. Jiayun spoke up, her voice gentle now. "Array, we don't want to hurt you, but if we're going to help you, we need to know everything. Can you trust us?" Array looked at each of them for a long moment, her eyes searching their faces. Then she slowly nodded. "I will tell you everything," she said quietly, "but you must promise not to tell anyone else." The crew nodded, agreeing to her terms. Array took a deep breath and began her story. "I was from a place called Zephoria. It's far away from here. My people were peaceful, but we were attacked. My ship, it was the only thing left. I don't know who did it. I don't know why, but I was the only one who survived." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "I left Zephoria to find answers. I came here, to your world. But when I arrived, my ship was damaged. I had no choice but to try and fix it. That's why I can do what I do." Jinwoo and the others sat in stunned silence. They had no idea how to respond to what Array had just said. Her story was too unbelievable, but the pain in her eyes was real. Finally, Yunjin spoke. "You've been through a lot, but we'll help you, Array. We'll help you find the answers you're looking for." Array nodded, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As the crew sat in silence, the weight of the mystery still hung in the air. Array's story was just the beginning. There were more questions, and they needed answers. But now, they had a promise to keep, to help Array find what she had lost. The crew sat in silence after Array shared her story. The room was heavy with the weight of her words. They all had so many questions, but it was clear that Array was still hurting from the past. She had lost everything, her people, her home, and now she was alone in the vast unknown. Yunjin was the first to break the silence. "Array, we'll help you find what's left of your people, but we need to know everything about your ship. If there's anything you can tell us, it could help us find answers." Array looked up at her, her eyes distant. "I don't know much," she said softly. "My ship was badly damaged. I don't know if it can still help, but I will try to remember everything." Jiyan nodded. "We're in this together now. If there's anything we can do, just tell us." Array smiled faintly. "Thank you." The crew knew that helping Array would not be easy. There were too many unknowns, but they had made a promise to her, and they couldn't turn back now. Over the next few days, Array continued to share little details about her home and her people. Her words were often fragmented, and sometimes she couldn't remember the names of places or people. But the crew listened carefully, hoping that every piece of information might lead to something bigger. One afternoon, Jinwoo and Array were sitting together in the control room. Jinwoo was studying the star maps, trying to find a path that could lead them to the place Array had come from. "Is this where you came from?" Jinwoo asked, pointing to a location on the map. Array leaned forward, her eyes scanning the stars. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it's so far away. I don't know if we can reach it." Jinwoo nodded. "It's going to be a long journey, but we can try. We have to try." The journey was difficult, and every day felt like a challenge. Array was still adjusting to life on the ship, and the crew continued to watch her closely, wondering what else she might be hiding. But despite the tension, there was a growing sense of trust between them. Array had shown that she was capable of more than anyone could have imagined, and the crew was starting to believe that she wasn't just a stranger. She was a part of their team now. One evening, as the ship sailed through the vast darkness of space, Jiyan approached Unjin in the crew's common room. "Do you think Array is telling us everything?" she asked, her voice low. Yunjin frowned. "I don't know. There's still so much we don't understand about her. She's holding something back, I'm sure of it." Jiyan looked thoughtful. "Maybe she doesn't want to talk about it. Maybe it's too painful." Yunjin sighed. "Maybe. But we can't help her if we don't know the truth." The next morning, Array came to the crew's meeting. Her expression was serious, and the crew immediately knew something was different. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady. "There is something I need to tell you." The crew turned their attention to her, waiting for her to continue. "I haven't been completely honest with you," Array said, her eyes downcast. "There is more to my story, more than I told you." The room grew quiet. Everyone held their breath, waiting for Array to explain. "I didn't just come to find my people," Array continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I came here for something else, something important." Jiyan stood up, her face filled with concern. "What are you talking about, Array?" Array took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not just a survivor. I'm part of something much bigger. My people were attacked, yes, but there's more to the story. We weren't just fighting for survival. We were protecting something." Yunjin narrowed her eyes. "What were you protecting?" Array's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "A powerful artifact. A weapon that could change everything." The crew exchanged nervous glances. A weapon? What did that mean? We were sent to find a safe place for it, Array continued. But my people were attacked before we could finish our mission. The weapon is still out there. And if it falls into the wrong hands... She paused, unable to finish her sentence. Jinwoo looked at her in disbelief. You mean the weapon is still out there, and it could be dangerous? Array nodded. Yes, that's why I need to find it. That's why I came here. I have to stop it from being used. Yunjin stepped forward. How do we find it? Do you know where it is? Array hesitated. I don't know exactly. But I think it's close. It's somewhere in this part of the galaxy. The crew was silent for a moment, trying to process everything Array had just told them. They had known that there was more to her story, but this was far beyond anything they had expected. Jian broke the silence. If this artifact is really as dangerous as you say, we have to find it before anyone else does. Yunjin nodded. We're in this together. Array, we'll help you find it. Array looked at the crew, her eyes filled with determination. Thank you. I couldn't do this alone. And so, the journey changed. The crew was no longer just trying to help Array find her people. Now they had a new mission, to find the artifact and keep it from falling into the wrong hands. They didn't know how difficult it would be or what dangers lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The atmosphere on the Hansong had shifted. What started as a mission to help Array find her people had quickly turned into a search for a powerful artifact. The crew was still processing the fact that they were now part of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. Yunjin sat in the command center, looking over the star maps again. The coordinates Array had given them were vague, but they were the only leads they had. The weapon could be somewhere nearby, hidden in the vastness of space. Array, are you sure these coordinates are correct? Yunjin asked, looking up from the map. Array nodded slowly. Yes, I think so. The weapon is old, and it was hidden away long ago. My people didn't want anyone to find it, especially not the enemies who attacked us. Jian, who had been working on the ship's communication system, looked up. Do we know what kind of weapon we're looking for? Is it something dangerous? Array hesitated for a moment, her expression serious. Yes, it's dangerous. But I don't know exactly what it does. All I know is that it's powerful, and it could change the fate of everything if it falls into the wrong hands. Jinwoo, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. So, it's not just about finding your people. We're stopping a potential disaster. Yes, Array said softly. It's more than that now. We have to find it before anyone else does. Yunjin stood up, her face hardening. Then we need to get moving. We don't know who's after it, but we can't afford to wait. The crew quickly made preparations. The Hansong was ready to move, and their mission was clear. They had to find this mysterious weapon before anyone else did. But there was still one big question that hung in the air. Who else was searching for it? The ship flew through space, traveling faster and faster toward the unknown. The crew worked together, monitoring the systems and keeping an eye on any signs of danger. As the days passed, they encountered nothing out of the ordinary, but the tension never left. Everyone was on edge, knowing that something big was ahead. Array kept mostly to herself, but she didn't look worried. It was as if she had a calm confidence, as though she knew what they were about to face. Every once in a while, she would speak to Yunjin, offering bits of information about the weapon. But even she didn't know all the details. It had been years since she last heard about it, and much had changed since then. Finally, after several days of traveling, the ship's sensors detected something unusual. A small distant object appeared on the radar, hidden behind a cloud of space dust. It was just a faint signal, but it was enough to get the crew's attention. Captain, we found something, Jinwoo reported, his voice tense. It's faint, but it looks like a structure of some kind. Yunjin stood up, her eyes narrowing. Could it be the artifact? Array came over to the control panel, her face serious. It's possible. We need to get closer. Without hesitation, Yunjin gave the order to change course. The Hansong moved closer to the strange object, its engines humming quietly. As they approached, the object became clearer. It looked like an ancient structure covered in space dust and time. It was big, much bigger than they had expected. "It's not a ship," Jian said, her voice filled with awe. "It's some kind of station or facility." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The structure looked old, but it also looked like it had been untouched for a long time. There was something eerie about it, like it was waiting for them. "We need to be careful," Yunjin said. "This could be a trap. Stay alert." The Hansong slowly approached the structure. As they got closer, the crew could see strange symbols on the walls of the facility. They didn't recognize them, but they could tell they weren't human. It was as if this place had been built by a different civilization. "We need to enter," Array said, her voice steady. "The weapon is inside." Yunjin nodded. "All right. Ji-Yun, Jinwoo, get ready to board. We're going in." The crew made preparations to board the strange facility. Array led the way, confident and calm. As they entered the facility, the temperature seemed to drop, and a strange humming noise filled the air. It was clear that this place hadn't been used in a long time, but it still had an unsettling energy. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols and strange markings. The crew walked cautiously, their steps echoing in the silence. They followed Array, who seemed to know exactly where she was going. "This way," Array said, leading them down a narrow hallway. Her eyes were focused, and the crew could tell she was determined. The hallway opened up into a large chamber. In the center of the room, there was a pedestal with something resting on top. The object was covered in dust, but the crew could see that it was glowing faintly. It was beautiful, but it also felt dangerous. "This is it," Array whispered. "This is the weapon." The crew stared at the pedestal, their hearts pounding. They had found it. But at the same time, they knew that their journey wasn't over. The weapon was only one part of the puzzle. The real challenge would be keeping it safe. Suddenly, the doors behind them slammed shut, and the humming noise grew louder. The crew turned to see dark shadows moving in the corners of the room. "Get ready," Yunjin shouted. The crew braced themselves. The real battle was about to begin.